Hey guys, Jason here from Casual Panic, here to talk to you guys about Resident Evil 4. Why am I talking about this 15-year-old game, you ask? Well, if you haven't heard, there was a data breach at good old Capcom that, in all actuality, isn't very good. A lot of personal information from current and former employees, along with their financial information, and even personal information on customers as well, were part of the breach. So, if you didn't know, now you know. Silver lining from this is, well, a whole chunk of information for current and future Capcom projects were part of this breach. Some of the things include the alleged release date for Resident Evil 8, which is supposed to be April of next year, or in like 5 months. But let's skip Resident Evil 8 for now and talk about another dish of info, a potential Resident Evil 4 remake. While still kind of unconfirmed, many assets that look like they could very well be from Resident Evil 4 have been leaked online. Now, as a huge fan of RE, I should be pretty excited about this, right? Well, I am. And not. And maybe. I played the hell out of Resident Evil 4 back in the day on the GameCube, and somewhat recently when it was ported to Xbox One. It's by far the Resident Evil I have the most memories with, and hey, Capcom loves it too, so much that, they ported the game 11 times since its release in 2005. That being said, do I really want this masterpiece of a game reinvigorated for the new generation? Again, yes. And no. And maybe. Let's jump into it and let's talk about the good, the bad, and the ugly of a Resident Evil 4 remake.
Where's everyone going? Bingo?
So jumping into the first thing as to why I don't think a Resident Evil 4 remake is really the best course of action right now. First of all, Resident Evil 4 still holds up to this day. The OG Resident Evil, along with Resident Evil 2 and 3, were all made before the start of the 2000s. I mean, these are definitions of classics to gaming. They're dating back 4 console generations at this point. So, of course, as a fan, I wanted to play through these games again, and in this current generation, the original's engines just weren't going to cut it to be taken seriously. So the remakes that followed ultimately did the games justice. RE4, while it is an old game from 2 or 3 generations ago, it still holds up this day as a modern game. RE4 was one of those games that was already way ahead of its times in terms of graphics, gameplay, and presentation. I just don't think remaking RE4 is the way to go, at least not just yet, which kind of leads me to my next point. There are other games that would be way better suited for a remake right now. Code Veronica, Outbreak. I'm truly baffled that Capcom isn't paying more attention to Code Veronica before RE4. Code Veronica is way more outdated than RE4, and it would have chronologically made sense to be made first. And on talks of older games, Resident Evil Outbreak would be a great thing to double down on right now with the release of Resistance as part of Resident Evil 3. I mean, that's really the multiplayer fans want anyways. I can't tell you the last time I played Resistance. I mean, hell, even a remake of RE0, or even the already remade RE1, could make a little bit more sense for a remake than RE4 right now. For a third reason, RE4, as I said before, has been ported so many times already. I said that before, right? It's not like people are hankering to play Resident Evil 4. If you want to play Resident Evil 4, take your pick. It's available on 11 different consoles. Resident Evil 4 is so widely available. Code Veronica, yeah, it's been ported to Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3. I don't know if there's a PC version out, but it's a game that I feel not a lot of people who may be interested in Resident Evil have had a chance to play yet. And it's certainly one of the better ones from its generation, so why not reinvigorate that one? You already have Claire from Resident Evil 2. I guess the argument can be made you have Leon from Resident Evil 2 as well, and you could use him for Resident Evil 4. But regardless, Resident Evil 4, too many times. The last bad issue that I'm going to bring up is, let's talk about Resident Evil 3 for a second, okay? Resident Evil 3, the remake, it was a good game, but I was pretty disappointed in the length of the game. Don't get me wrong, Resident Evil 3, the original, Nemesis, wasn't a very long game either, but at least in that game, it had the live choices. You know, it changed. It actually, those choices changed some outcomes of the story depending on, you know, if Nikolai would be killed by a nemesis, or you'd have to fight him in the helicopter, or you kill him in the helicopter. And not only that, I mean, that, you know, choosing specific life choices or live choices would affect whether Barry would appear to help you at the end or not. You know, as much as Resident Evil 3, the original, was short, it still had a lot of replayability. And, you know, the new one was good. It had a lot of new features to it that made it really fun. You know, there were the bunch of different difficulty settings, so you could go and speed run through a whole bunch of them, but it still just kind of felt like I could beat the game in 2 hours, which is fine. I mean, that's what Resident Evil's for. But, you know, to circle this back to Resident Evil 4, Resident Evil 4 was actually one of the lengthiest Resident Evil games ever made. I mean, the average completion time was 16 hours. You know, Resident Evil 5 was, I think, the longest, or Resident Evil 6, actually, when you know, add up all the different campaigns. But Resident Evil 4 was up there. And I wouldn't want them to take away from what Resident Evil 4 had. Like, every piece, every setting in that game was important to the overall quality of the game. The Resident Evil 3 remake removed the entire clock tower section, which I was very disappointed in. As much as I want to play Resident Evil 4 again, and as much as it would be cool to see it, you know, with all the next-gen engines and graphics and controls, I do kind of have a feeling that we may be let down a little bit. So now that I've gone ahead and complained for the better half of 3 minutes, let's rewind this a little bit and let me go and contradict myself and say why I think Resident Evil 4 Remake could be a good thing. You know, to start off, I mean, to see that Capcom is very interested in remaking their classics shows that at some point we may have a remake for the likes of Code Veronica or Outbreak or, you know, the Resident Evil 0 or what have you. You know, as I've said a few times now, if there's a game that needs a remake, it's Code Veronica. Code Veronica is in its own category where it's just advanced enough to set itself different from the 3 classics, but old enough that it could definitely use a facelift, both graphically and gameplay-wise. For this next point, let's look at this situation in sort of a vacuum, right? I mean, they're remaking Resident Evil 4. Resident Evil 4 quite could be the best Resident Evil game ever made. I know that's subjective. Go ahead and let me know in the comments if I'm crazy, but seriously, I mean, let's think back. I mean, Resident Evil 4 was that game that was coming out that all of the Game Informer magazines were talking about. It was the next generation Resident Evil, the one that introduced over-the-shoulder cameras, an entirely new country. You know, you're playing as Leon, you know, one of the best Resident Evil characters of all time, a fan favorite, and just this amazing game with new characters, an expandable weapons system, lots of weapons, a currency system, you know, a much more vast map with very different enemy types. And for the first time, we weren't just fighting zombies and mutants, we were fighting crazy people who happened to be mutants, but you get what I'm saying. Resident Evil 4 was probably the game that put them on the map. And that kind of goes into my next point, is Resident Evil 4 is the game that put Resident Evil on the map. I mean, I still talk to people to this day who have never played another Resident Evil outside of Resident Evil 4. Or rather, they only played Resident Evil from Resident Evil 4 and onward. They never played the classics. They never played Resident Evil 1, 2, or 3. You know, what Capcom's doing with the remakes is kind of helping with that. They're showing people that there is a good game here, and they're just bringing it to attention with new engine, new graphics, better gameplay. This could be a good thing. I know that I said a lot of bad things, but again, it's Resident Evil 4, and I know that is a very subjective and blunt way of putting a good thing, but I mean, hey, it's a classic. I really can't say I will be disappointed in more Resident Evil, and I really can't say I will be upset with a new Resident Evil game coming out. And finally, I don't think I'd be upset with a Resident Evil 4 remake. You know I said before, it probably isn't the game to make now, but that doesn't necessarily mean I'm not going to play it. no matter how much they change up the formula. Speaking of changing up the formula, let's talk about that. Let's go over some of the things, based on the remakes that we saw from Remake Resident Evil 2 and Resident Evil 3, and see how that might affect Resident Evil 4's gameplay. The first thing that comes to mind is the combat, right? So Resident Evil 2 Remake, Resident Evil 3 Remake actually had a similar combat system to Resident Evil 4. Of course, Resident Evil 4, you had to shoot stationary, which is one thing that I think will most likely change, right? I mean, the new remakes took advantage of a better engine, which allowed them to put this much more complex combat system into the game, right? So I believe Resident Evil 4 is going to follow the same suit. We're going to have the mobile combat, we're going to have the self-defense weapons. I do think they're going to expand a little bit more on what they were doing with Resident Evil 3. In the remake for Resident Evil 3, you could actually perform like a slow-mo dodge and get like a critical shot on the enemy. I think something of that vein is going to be available in the Resident Evil 4 remake, but I do think they're going to bring back some of that melee combat that they introduced in Resident Evil 4. When you shoot an enemy in the face and you could do like a roundhouse kick on them, or if you shoot them in the legs and you could suplex them from behind. I do hope that they bring some of that back. I think they might ground it a little bit better, but I do think that that's going to make a return. But for the most part, it's going to be a lot more faster-based combat in the same vein of Resident Evil 3 Remake. I also think that, again, I harken back to Resident Evil 3's remake. They made Carlos have a much bigger role in the story, and you as the player actually played as Carlos more times in the remake than you did in the original. I do think that in this new Resident Evil 4, you're going to be playing as a lot more characters other than Leon. I could see, I do think the standard Ashley section is going to be back, but I actually could see the player taking control of Lewis and maybe even Ada throughout the main story and not just in a separate campaign. In fact, I would be as bold as to say that they probably won't bring back Ada's campaign. Just based on what they did in Resident Evil 3 and just streamlining the story a little bit, and also in Resident Evil 2's remake, I know they had the separate campaigns and the interconnected storylines, but if you look at the Leon A and Claire B, that wasn't really a thing in Remake 2. So I do think that Ada is going to be introduced into the story in a much more linear fashion, which I don't necessarily like, but I do think that's something to consider that might happen. There may even be a section that you play as Krauser for all we know. I mean, that would be pretty cool. You're able to play as Krauser in the Mercenaries, which was awesome, of course. But I really think that it would be really cool to play as Krauser throughout the main story. Granted, he is helping Sadler, so I don't really understand what type of, firefights he could get himself into since he is, an assistant to Sadler. But, I mean, I think it could be an interesting section nonetheless. I also think that they're going to reduce the amount of puzzles in this one. Just, again, I'm constantly relating back to the remakes because I can see what they're trying to do. They're going for a much more linear playstyle of gameplay. Resident Evil 2 Remake and Resident Evil 3 especially had a lot less puzzles. I mean, I guess you could say I'm kind of glad that Resident Evil 3 didn't bring back the water puzzle, but I kind of wish there were a little bit more. All the puzzles were pretty straightforward and very far in between. In Resident Evil 4, I imagine that a lot of them are going to be removed. I think back at the Ashley Knight puzzle, right? The one that they allowed you to skip in further iterations of the game. I can see that being removed entirely, maybe replaced with something else. But, I mean, that's kind of a bummer to me, too. I mean, I do think that the puzzles are kind of what give Resident Evil its charm, so I'd be a little upset if they did that. But I do think that that's something that is, something to keep an eye on. And the last thing I can think of is the inventory system, right? I mean, I really want them to bring back Master Suitcase, and that would be amazing, but I just don't think it's going to happen. I think they're going to use the same exact way as the two other remakes, and it's going to be a much more simplified, streamlined inventory system where you have up to 4 weapons equipped and, have the healing items sort of hotkeyed, which is kind of a bummer. I mean, I did think the suitcase, it was a little weird, right? I mean, I can't imagine Leon was running around with a suitcase that could not only hold a rocket launcher and several large bass, but could also hold his machine guns, shotguns, pistols, ammo. It didn't make much sense. Granted, it's a video game, so I get that, but it was a little bizarre. One thing I don't think they're going to change is the merchant. I just think that if they were to remove the merchant, I think that he'll be altered some way. You know, he's obviously going to get a graphic update, but I think they may involve him a little bit more in the story. I just feel like, you know, honestly, in the old games, Leon never really said a word to the merchant, right? He just kind of appeared in one cutscene. Leon kind of walked up to him with his gun raised and was like, hey, and what are you buying, stranger? And that was that. That was their whole relationship, was just the merchant's weird voice and Leon just quietly dealing with a black marchant foreign weapons dealer. So I think they might make him more important to the overall story for Resident Evil 4 Remake. Now, one last bizarre thought. What if they added more RPG elements to the game? Now, calm down. I'm not saying to completely change Resident Evil to a open world Skyrim adventure, but imagine if, like, you know, I mean, think about Resident Evil 4 for a second, and Resident Evil 5. Those games, you could actually acquire new guns, buy new guns, and upgrade their firepower, reload speed, ammo capacity. And even in the new ones, I mean, you could find components to make the guns better. I mean, that is your basic level of RPG element in a game. Imagine if they added things like health, speed, resistance, just little things that you could do to upgrade Leon or upgrade other characters in Resident Evil 4. Now, I'm not saying I want this, I'm just saying, think about some of the things that are more commonplace for the series right now, right? A lot of that stuff you have Resident Evil 4 to thank. And not even just because of the over-the-shoulder camera, right? I mean, everyone always says Resident Evil 4 was when the series really took a turn. It started to tread that line of survival horror and action game. What if Resident Evil 4 becomes this less linear game and evolves in a similar way that it did back then? I know that that's kind of out of left field, right? I mean, it would be interesting on paper, but hard to accept as reality. I would be interested in seeing that happen. I know everyone is always like, oh, not every game needs to be an open world, not every game needs to be an RPG. Resident Evil has always been Capcom's sort of guinea pig. I mean, they created a whole engine just for this game, and, you know, think about all the games of Resident Evil past. I mean, we started off with tank control survival horror games, and we moved our way up to having third person over the camera, action sequences, then bringing it back down to mobile shooting. We've thrown in first person in there with some success. We've had some minor RPG elements in the games. What if this could potentially be the next step for Resident Evil's evolution? Just something to think about. That's going to wrap it up for here, guys. As you might be able to tell, Resident Evil is one of my favorite game series of all time. Hearing about RE4 getting a remake just kind of got my head spinning. I just had to word vomit on you guys for a minute. So now's your chance. Let me know what you guys think about these rumors in the comments. Are you excited for an RE4 remake? What other changes to the game do you think Capcom will make? And guys, if I piqued your interest at all, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel. We are almost at 100 subs! Hope you guys are faring well with everything going on, and I hope you have a happy and safe holiday this year. Thank you guys as always for tuning in to Casual Panic. I've been Jason, you've been awesome, I'll see you in the next one.